In this lecture, we're going to discuss cognitive psychology, information processing, and cognitive load. To begin with foundations of cognitive theory. Cognitive theory was based on rationalism. It came at a time directly following behaviorism, which was based on stimulus and response, and really left out any study or discussion of the mind. So cognitive theory came along and said, we know this exists, we know there's things going on in the mind, and we need to study them. And so they began studying rationalism and reason, and they believed that reason was the primary source of valid and reliable knowledge, and further, sensory experience is interpreted by structures of the mind. So how about defining cognition? Cognition is the activity of knowing, including the acquisition or construction, organization, and use of knowledge. So now let's discuss the information processing model, which is a model for memory and is based on the foundations of cognitive psychology theory. Information processing started as a metaphor that the human brain or human memory system works like a computer. There's inputs and outputs, and the human memory system transforms the input so it can be used. It stores, transform input and memory, and performs operations on the input in order to use it. Atkinson and Shiffrin developed this dual store model. In this model, they posit that there are three types of memory, including the sensory register, the short-term store, and the long-term store. I just scrolled through 3 pictures. Do you remember what images you saw? Likely you do not. That's because I went through them very quickly. It was a piece of pizza, a Venus flytrap, and a turtle riding on an alligator. Strange pictures, I know. But the point is, we just used our sensory register. The sensory register basically states that there is a register for each sense. The capacity is unlimited. The duration is 1 to 2 seconds. And if we don't pay attention to it, we lose it. That's why you might not remember all of the pictures that you saw very quickly. But if you did pay attention to it, if the images were personally relevant to you in any way, and you rehearse them, then you could move them into your working memory. So how does information move from the sensory register into the next type of memory, short-term store? Well, it begins with attention. This is the primary factor in determining which information moves on for further processing. Factors that influence attention include motion, size, intensity, novelty, incongruity, social cues, emotion, and personal significance. The next is perception. What we perceive is influenced by what we already know. We're more likely to pay attention if the stimulus activates a known pattern. Pay attention to this list of words. I'll give you about 10 seconds. Try to remember as many as you can. Now take about 10 seconds and write down as many of the words from the previous slide that you can remember. The words were couch, strange, moose, draft, tonic, first, pebble, lemon, walk, and turn. How many did you have correct? The point was, you just saw an example of using your short-term store or working memory. The capacity of the short-term store is 5 to 9 unrelated items. I bet on the list of words you had between 5 to 9 items. The duration is about 15 to 20 seconds. The control processes include rehearsal. Rehearsal maintains information in short-term store and leads to transfer into the long-term store. Also, you can use coding of images or rhymes. And then for retrieval, you can generate probes for scanning long-term store. As discussed on the previous slide, an effective way to move things from short-term memory to long-term memory is known as rehearsal. And this is simply repeating information to maintain it in your short-term memory. There are two different types of rehearsal. The first is maintenance rehearsal, and this is simply repeating information over and over again, holding it in your short-term memory, and maybe even moving it into your long-term memory. However, it's not all that effective because you're not learning it in a meaningful way. A more meaningful type of rehearsal is called elaborative rehearsal. And this is relating incoming information to your prior knowledge. For instance, I remembered all the parts of the ear from anatomy class by relating it to the parts of a concert venue. Now I'd like you to think about a vacation that you've went on at any time in your life. Write down as much information and details as you can from that vacation. Please pause the video and press play when you're done writing down all the details of your vacation. The details of your vacation that you just wrote down are an example of you using information that's stored in your long-term memory store. The capacity of long-term memory is potentially unlimited, and the duration is permanent. And I know what you're thinking, I forget stuff all the time. Well, the research suggests that that information is still there. However, you don't have the necessary cues to retrieve it from long-term memory. There are three basic types of knowledge represented in long-term memory. The first is declarative knowledge, and this is knowledge for isolated facts and information. The next is procedural knowledge, which is how to do things, and finally metacognitive knowledge. So according to Atkinson and Shiffrin, why is information transferred to long-term memory? This occurs through rehearsal. And how does the retrieval of information and images in long-term store occur? Through the generation of probes. You scan your memory store for a match. And why do we forget? Because you have the wrong probes generated, preventing a match. And now we'll move to an important idea that comes from information processing model, and that's the idea of cognitive load. Cognitive load is the demand placed on the working memory capacity which exists in the short-term store. When the demand exceeds capacity, learning suffers. The next slides present example lessons. One lesson has greater demand on cognitive load than the other. While you look at them, I want you to think about which one has the greatest cognitive load and why. So let's begin. This is example A. Try to look at it and think about how much cognitive load it requires. And then we'll look at a second example. Here's example B. Try to compare this to A and try to decide which one has more and less cognitive load. So which one had the greatest cognitive load and why? Example B, because it had a visual illustrating the angles on the triangle, the separate text explaining the angles, and it required holding text and visual in working memory to integrate. There was too much information to try to process in our limited working memory system. Example A did not overload working memory. The visual and text were integrated. So now let's move to the final slide, implications for teaching. There's three main implications that I'd like you to walk away with from this lecture. The first is to really consider students' working memory capacity and cognitive load when designing instruction. Be intentional about it. Does your instruction cause cognitive overload? If so, in what ways can you reduce the cognitive load that your students are feeling? The second implication is to have students use elaborative rehearsal rather than maintenance rehearsal. In a lot of classes, and we do this because this is the way we learn, we have students repeat information over and over again. Well, although this can work to remember information, elaborative rehearsal is more impactful because you develop cues and probes that make it more likely that you are able to retrieve the information from your long-term store. And finally, there are different types of long-term knowledge, including declarative knowledge, procedural knowledge, and metacognitive knowledge. And the way in which students learn is different based on what type of knowledge they are learning.